Story 1. The Haunting of the Secret Basement. When I was a teenager, my friends and I were a wild bunch. We lived in a sleepy suburb in northern New Jersey, but we found excitement in all the wrong places. Our favorite pastime was sneaking into abandoned buildings at night, fueled by a mix of boredom and adrenaline. One night, our thrill-seeking led us to a bowling alley where one of our friends, Rowan, had just started working. Rowan was a drifter, never one to stick with one job for long. This bowling alley job was his latest, and it came with perks, like keys to the building. It didn't take much convincing to convince our sweet-talking Anish to let Rowan let us explore the alley after hours. We had no idea how dangerous the night would be. There were 5 of us: me, Rowan, Anish, Chip, and Jason. We had a few drinks before heading out, except for Jason, who insisted on staying sober enough to drive. The drive to the alley was filled with nervous excitement, and by the time we arrived, we were buzzing with anticipation. Rowan unlocked the door, and we slipped inside, our footsteps echoing through the empty building. At first, we were just fooling around, sliding down the lanes like they were slip and slides, laughing and screaming. But the real adventure began when Rowan led us to an area reserved for employees only. We found a dusty storage room filled with old equipment and boxes stacked to the ceiling. That's when we heard a loud noise from below, like something had been knocked over. We froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Jason, always calm, asked if there was a basement. Rowan shook his head, but there was doubt in his eyes. Anish, never one to back down from a challenge, grinned and started looking around. That's when Jason found the trapdoor, hidden under the rug in the corner of the room. The atmosphere went from playful to serious in an instant. Jason opened the trapdoor, revealing an old, rusted ladder leading into the darkness. Chip, cautious, wanted to leave, but Jason was already down in the abyss. One by one, we followed, Chip staying behind, too scared to join us. The basement was a maze of dusty boxes and forgotten junk. But something felt off, like we weren't alone. Then we saw it, a door in the corner of the basement. Jason reached for the handle, but before he could turn it, we heard that clanking sound again, this time from behind the door. It was bigger now, more purposeful. We looked at each other, our fear mirrored in each other's eyes. Jason, unfazed, opened the door a crack, revealing another storage room. But it wasn't empty. In the corner, there was a figure sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing away. We were paralyzed with fear, our minds racing to comprehend what we were seeing. Then the figure moved, banging its head against the wall with a sickening thud. It was the sound we'd heard. I turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest, but Jason pushed the door open wider. The figure turned, and I caught a glimpse of a dirty, unkempt man, his hair disheveled, his face twisted in a snarl of horror. He lunged at us, but Rowan stumbled, falling to the ground. The man lunged at him, and we could hear Rowan screaming as he tried to get away. Chip, who was looking down from the top of the ladder, grabbed a metal pipe and threw it, hitting the man in the head. Rowan jumped to his feet, and we all ran, up the ladder and out of the basement. Chip slammed the hatch shut, and we didn't stop running until we were outside, panting. Jason drove us back, his face pale, his hands shaking. None of us said anything. The reality of what had just happened was too terrifying to put into words. Rowan quit the next day, too terrified to return. We never found out who the man was or how he got into the basement. But the memory of his face, twisted with rage and madness, still haunts me. We came very close to something truly evil that night, and it was a lesson I won't soon forget. Story 2. Creeper Bob's Unwanted Attention. When I was 13, My friends and I had a weekend tradition of going to the local bowling alley. It was a rundown place, perfect for a group of kids on a budget. We'd play a few games, maybe grab some pizza afterward, and call it a night. The alley was usually crowded, and we'd see familiar faces, but one face always stood out. A man we nicknamed Creeper Bob. Bob was always alone, bowling on the adult side of the alley where they served alcohol. He had a strange habit of wandering around the alley, watching people bowl, then returning to his lane. His eyes lingered too long, especially on us. At first we laughed it off, but it didn't take long for his presence to go from weird to downright creepy. One night, he took it a step further. We were in our usual lane laughing when Bob appeared next to us. Without saying a word, he began his game, occasionally glancing at us. Then he started talking to us, making comments on our forms, giving us unsolicited advice, and telling us about how he watched us every weekend. He meant to be friendly, but there was something off about the way he said it. His presence made the atmosphere uncomfortable. It got worse when I was about to shoot. Bob stepped into our lane and grabbed my wrist, trying to position me for better stance. His touch was cold and unwelcome, and I froze. My friend stood there, equally nervous but unsure of what to do. We were just kids, after all. The night ended abruptly after that. We decided to skip the rest of the game and instead spend our money on pizza, anything to get away from Bob. As we pulled out of the alley and headed home, the sound of an engine made us turn around. A beat-up SUV was doing a three-point turn, and when it started tailgating us, our worst fears were confirmed. It was Bob. He pulled up next to us, offering a ride home. We declined, picking up our pace, but Bob persisted. He insisted that it wasn't safe for us to walk alone at night. Panic set in, and we broke into a run, splitting up when we reached the intersection. I sprinted the last few blocks home, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got home, the lights were off. My dad was asleep, and my mom and sister were out. Not wanting to wake anyone, I went around to the back of the house to get the spare key. When I opened the door, I heard footsteps behind me, but before I could turn around, someone grabbed me from behind, covered my mouth, and wrapped his arms around my neck. I struggled, clawing at the man's arms, trying to scream. Finally, I got free enough to scream for my dad. My scream must have startled him because he let go and ran away. I didn't look back. I ran inside and up the stairs, screaming for my dad. He rushed outside, and after I told him what had happened, he checked the backyard but found nothing. We filed a police report, but the bowling alley refused to release any of the footage. I never saw Bob again, but I never went back to that bowling alley either. To this day, I can't be certain that the man who attacked me was Bob, but the chances of it being someone else are too low to be reassuring. Story 3. The Man in the Loft. Rebecca and I were looking forward to a fun night of bowling, just a simple date night to unwind after a long week. We hadn't been bowling in years, so we thought it would be a fun reminiscence. But the night quickly took a turn for the worse. After renting shoes and finding the perfect ball, we started the game. It was clear that neither of us were doing well. Rebecca kept missing the ball, and I wasn't doing much better. I tried to help her, but my advice was useless. Then, as if the night couldn't get any worse, Rebecca's ex-boyfriend walked in with a group of friends and started bowling just a few lanes away from us. Rebecca immediately tensed up, not even sparing him a glance. She whispered to me that we needed to leave, and I didn't argue. We gathered our things and she headed to the car while I returned the shoes. As I stood at the counter, I noticed her ex looking at me. I quickly looked away, not wanting to make things worse. We drove home in silence, deciding to salvage the night by playing Wii bowling instead. Back home, we opened a bottle of wine and set up the Wii. It turned out to be much more fun than the actual game, and we were soon laughing and enjoying ourselves. But then, in a brief moment of silence between songs, we both heard a loud noise coming from upstairs. I paused the game, and we stared at each other. Rebecca asked me if I heard it, and I nodded. I decided to check, grabbing a broom from the closet just in case. It was quiet upstairs, eerily so, and each step I took up the creaking stairs was heavier than the last. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old house sinking, but the sound was too deliberate, too loud. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening for any other noises. The hallway was dark, the shadows tricking my eyes. I turned toward the source of the noise, which seemed to be coming from the attic. The entrance to the attic was a small square door in the ceiling of the hallway, accessible only by a rickety ladder. As I stood beneath the attic door, I hesitated. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to disturb whatever might be lurking there. But Rebecca was downstairs, and I couldn't ignore her. I reached up, grabbed the pull cord, and slowly lowered the ladder. The rusty hinges groaned, echoing throughout the house, making my heartbeat even faster. I climbed the ladder cautiously, clutching the broom. When my head reached the attic floor, I shined the flashlight around, illuminating the cluttered space. Boxes, old furniture, and forgotten belongings were piled haphazardly, casting light. Everything seemed still, untouched, just as I was about to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. I saw it. Movement in the far corner. A dark figure, hunched over, its back turned to me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a pale, gaunt face, its eyes sunken and wide, staring straight at me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, almost falling off the ladder. The figure didn't move, just stared with those empty eyes. I crawled down the ladder, almost jumping the last few steps, and slammed the loft door shut. My hands shook as I tried to pull the ladder up. The figure's eyes seared into my mind. I ran down the stairs, almost tripping in my haste. Rebecca was standing at the bottom, her face pale with fear. She saw the horror in my eyes and didn't ask any questions. I grabbed her hand, and without a word, we rushed out of the house, not even bothering to lock the door behind us. We drove as fast as we could, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Rebecca kept asking me what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. All I could think about was that face, those empty eyes that seemed to see right through me. We didn't go back to that house that night. We stayed in a hotel, too scared to even think about going back. The next day, I called a locksmith to change all the locks and called a moving company to pack up our things. We never set foot in that house again.